going to practice using our radian measures, and we are going to have to find the exact measure of an angle when it's given to us in radians. So you have to decide whether you're going to use the unit circle or triangles. And by triangles, remember, I mean your 30, 60, 90 and your 45, 45, 90 triangles. So let's just get right down to it. Let's say I asked you to find the exact value of sine pi over 3. I'm going to show you how I think about it using the unit circle. First of all, as I mentioned in the recording the other day, for the 10 of you who watched it, that in quadrant 1, all I have to memorize are these, and there's a pattern to them, which we talked about in class. And then I realized that it's the same answers just reflected into the different quadrants. So pi over 3, all I have to do is find my pi over 3, which is right there, and I realize I'm using these 2 points. Okay, I want the sine. Sine's the y value. Boom, done. Radical 3 over 2. If I triangles, I have to know that pi over 3 is in my 30, 60, 90 triangle. I would have had to kind of done a little extra work. I would have to realize, well, pi over 3 is 180 over 3, and 180 divided by 3 is 60. Now sine tells me that I want to put opposite over hypotenuse. And also 60 degrees is over here in my first quadrant. So now I realize that everybody's positive there, and I can finally get my final answer that the sine of pi over 3 is really radical 3 over 2. All right, let's try a little different one. Cosine of negative 4 pi over 3. And I'm going to use my unit circle, and I'm going to have to do a little detective work. I look at 4 pi over 3 as 3 pi over 3 plus another third. So this is saying I went a full pi and then a third more. This will give me a clue as to which quadrant I'm in without having to know the exact measurement. I went a full pi, and notice it's negative, so I'm going backwards. A full pi is 180 degrees, so I went 180 degrees and then a third of the way more. So I didn't quite make it out of the second quadrant because half would make it out, and I'm only a third, so I know I'm here in the second quadrant. Okay, so let's just take our points for pi over 3. Here's pi over 3. And let's just put them into the second quadrant. Well, when I'm in the second quadrant, I flipped over the y-axis, therefore negating the x value. Or you can look at the fact that when I'm in the second quadrant, I moved this way on the x-axis, which is in negative direction, and then up on the y, which is positive. So therefore my x value is negative and my y value is positive. That's great. Cosine means the x value. Bingo, there's my answer. Negative 1/2 is my final answer. To do that as a triangle, we come over here and once again we look at the multiple and we realize that it's pi over 3. So pi over 3 is 60. And cosine says to take the adjacent side and put it over the hypotenuse. Now I have to figure out which quadrant I'm in. That's going to require me, yet again, converting back to degrees. Negative 240, so I'm going to go backwards 240 degrees. Backwards 90, backwards 180, backwards 240. Brings me into the second quadrant where only sine is allowed to be positive, so therefore cosine must have been negative. Let's work with a different one now. Let's work with pi over 4. Cotangent of 5 pi over 4 using my unit circle. I know that I'm going to use my pi over 4. Now I just have to figure out which quadrant I'm in. Well, 5 pi over 4, to me I went a whole 4 pi over 4 plus a quarter of the way more. So a whole, and then a quarter of the way would bring me into the third quadrant. So if this point were to go over, reflect over the origin, if you remembered your geometry, everybody negates. So this would be negative radical 2 over 2, negative radical 2 over 2. Or once again, you can look at it as I went over in a negative direction and I went down in a negative direction, so therefore my x and my y are negative. Lots of different ways to remember this. Now, cotangent means tangent, flipped. So, cotangent equals 1 over tangent, which means this is 1 over the sine over cosine, and I flip that. So basically I want to take my cosine value and put it over my sine value. All right, my cosine value is negative radical 2 over 2, and my sine value is negative radical 2 over 2, and anything divided by itself is 1, and a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So I figured out up here that the cotangent of 5 pi over 4 equals 1. All right, once again working with triangles, I'd have to come up here, find my triangle for pi over 4. There it is. Cotangent is tangent flipped, so it's adjacent over opposite. All right, so I know it's 1. Now, 5 pi over 4, I could do the same thing. I got to figure out what quadrant I'm in. So I can still look at the same way. I can think of it as 4 pi over 4 plus pi over 4. Same thing. I go a full pi and then a quarter of a pi more. So I'm in this quadrant where tangent is positive, so therefore my answer is positive 1. We'll look at one last one. 11 pi over 6, so that way we get to look at each of the multiples. All right, there's pi over 6 right there. So I know secant refers to cosine, so I'm going to flip that. So I know I am 2 over radical 3. Rationalize that, I get 2 radical 3 over 3. All right, so I know that's part of my answer. Now I just have to figure out, is it positive or negative? Where does 11 pi over 6 get me? Well, 6 pi over 6 is a whole, and then I still have 5 pi over 6. So how far did I go? Well, I went a whole pi, and then 5 pi over 6 is darn near close to another whole. So I'm right here. And if I take this point and reflect it into this quadrant, that means I'm reflecting over the x-axis, so the y value negates, and nothing happened to my x. I went to get into the fourth quadrant, I move positive x, and I move negative y. So therefore my answer is positive. So I don't have to change anything, and there's my final answer. 2 radical 3 over 3. Once again, if I were to use my triangles, I'd have to realize that I'm dealing with pi over 6. So here's pi over 6. Secant is cosine flipped, so instead of adjacent over hypotenuse, I have hypotenuse over adjacent. Rationalize it to 2 radical 3 over 3. And now I just have to simply figure out, Now I simply have to figure out what quadrant I'm in, and I can do the same philosophy. 11 pi over 6 really means that I almost went a full, this is really close to 12 pi over 6, which is 2 pi. So I pretty much went a full circle. I'm just short of a full circle. And in that, cosine is positive. And since secant is the reciprocal of cosine, it's positive 2 radical 3 over 3.